We're really all supposed to be saints. That's the goal anyway. The word saint comes from the Greek hagiazo, which means to set apart, to sanctify, or to make holy. And when we see it in Paul's letter, it's often translated holy ones or the Lord's people. And when we think of saints, we often think of people like Mother Teresa or Simon Peter, people whose lives were evaluated after their deaths as being extra special, even extraordinary. But you know, when we see the word in the New Testament, it's often not used that way. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, for instance, were written to one of the most conflicted churches in the entire New Testament. And when Paul wrote those letters, he opened both of those letters by calling the people in that church saints, which may actually set some of you at ease this morning. It hasn't happened this year, but often when we come to this time in the year and we're talking with people about chiming their loved ones, we'll have a question. Should my loved one be mentioned and chimed as a saint? I mean, I loved her. She was special to me. She blessed my life, but she was no saint, which may be true, though in the spirit of the day, probably not quite as true as you might think. First, because the real spirit of the day is that we would come before God and remember those special people God has given us, as prized or as imperfect as they may be. These are our saints today. And secondly, because in the New Testament, a saint seemed to be less an earned title achieved upon evaluation of an extraordinary life, and more an inherited calling for those who have decided to follow Jesus. Matthew Fox does a good job capturing this when he writes that biblically, the term saint applies to each of us. All who are attempting to imitate the Christ in their lives merit the title of saint, though some do it more fully than others, and some are willing to let go of more of themselves to get the job done. And in this way, saint is less a certificate of completion and much more like the degree I earned in preparation for being your pastor. Master of Divinity. Sounds like I went to the University of He-Man or Harry Potter, for crying out loud. I much prefer the abbreviated MDiv because while you may be able to get away with being a master of business or a master of education, does anyone really think I have mastered divinity? No. It's embarrassing. About as embarrassing as it would be for me to go around and call myself a saint. Or perhaps as embarrassing as it might be for you if I were to go around and call you saints. Imagine if we were to start introducing one another as saints, Saint Connie or Saint Chip. Could we really do that without a bit of a smirk on our face or a tinge of sarcasm in our voice? I don't think so. And yet, that is who you are. Because that is who we are. We're all supposed to be saints. Just as the title of my degree is really supposed to be more a challenge than an embarrassment, our inheritance as saints of God is far less about achievement than it is about calling. If you are a follower of Christ, then you are a saint. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good, because discomfort is inherent in the challenge. We certainly feel this in Luke chapter 6. I've actually wondered at times why the church would include this passage of Scripture in its chosen text, often for All Saints' Day. I mean, Jesus does offer a blessing on those who are poor, those who are hungry, and those who are weeping, and these are certainly good words of good news today. To hear Jesus himself offer a blessing over us in the midst of our grief and our tears is timely today, just as it was for them on that day. The people gathered round Jesus in this moment in time were suffering, and so his words were no doubt soothing, just as I'm sure they were a bit confusing, because they didn't make sense. Because let's be honest, blessed are the hungry and woe to the well-fed doesn't make a lot of sense to a rumbling stomach. These people needed more than just some inspiration. They were looking for something real, something that could really impact their lives and the lives of people in the world around them. And I think, as I know you do, that Jesus was giving them something real. I think Jesus was giving these people, the poor, the bereaved, and the persecuted, a real invitation to a real way of life that would change them, change their circumstances, and change the circumstances of the world. Not an easy life, but a good life. Remember? A way of life that if they could embrace it, would begin to meet both their needs and would meet the deep needs of a world that was hurting all around them. A world that was desperately in need of a community of saints formed and fashioned by the ministry and life and good news of Jesus Christ. Remember, this is a key moment in the life and ministry of Jesus and in the history of the church. Jesus has just come down off the mountain where he spent a night in prayer searching for direction. He's then choosing 12 apostles from his disciples to offer leadership and to serve as representatives of a new Israel. 12 tribes, remember, of Israel, and now 12 apostles. This is a symbol of the beginning of a new covenant. And then Jesus turns to the larger group, the saints who have chosen to follow him. And he gives them guidelines that are meant to help them carry his good news into a world that desperately needs it in both word and even more especially in deed. To those who are listening, Jesus says, which I think is just fantastic because it acknowledges right off the bat that some who are gathered around him are not listening. It reminds me of the Sprint guy who used to be the Verizon guy who would go all around all over the earth saying, "Do you hear me now?" And then when he became the Sprint guy, he started saying, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" Hoping that maybe you've picked up on some things he's saying about his new character, some new features that might be worth your time. "Can you hear me now?" and "Did you hear that?" were really his way of saying, listen up. Listen up, because what I'm about to tell you could make your life better. That's his opinion anyway. It may or may not be worth much, but it might at least prompt you to reevaluate your current plan. And I think this is also in the spirit of Jesus' prompt here. We're worshiping today for much the same reason those disciples were gathered round him on that day. Because we think Jesus matters a lot. And because we think Jesus matters a lot, we think Jesus' opinion matters a lot too. But are we listening? Are you listening? Are you really, really listening? To those who feel you've been slighted by someone in your life, are you listening? To those who are being eaten up this morning by anger and resentment, are you listening? To those who have found themselves sucked in by the nastiness and vitriol of this current presidential election, are you listening? To those who have allowed the toxicity in our public discourse to poison the way we're treating one another, whether it be in person or at a distance or online, to those who have found themselves so tempted to throw shade on others or take shots at others, other human beings who are souls of God, saints of God, created in the image of God, are you listening? To those who are listening, Jesus says this: love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Are you listening? If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone take what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Are you listening? He goes on. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as God in heaven is also merciful. You know, sometimes Jesus' sermons don't need too much interpretation or commentary. No, sometimes we simply need to consider where we are, who we are, and what we're currently dealing with, and then simply allow His words to deal with us. And my fellow saints, I think one of the best things we could do this week is listen to the words of Jesus and allow them to deal with us and direct us into a better present and an even better future. And if that's not enough, if we need a little more help, if we need a little more inspiration, perhaps we could also take some time to consider the lives of others we've known who have done that especially well. Some do seem more saintly than others, after all, and we can learn from them. I know I continue to learn from many of you as I continue to be challenged by the lives that many of you live. There are some people in our midst, and you know them, who are just deeply and unusually good. You can think of them right now. They listen well. They make you feel valued and funny even when you're with them. We often catch them looking after other people, and when they do, their laugh is enchanting and their manner is infused with gratitude. They don't seem to think about the wonderful work they're doing or the wonderful lives they're living. In fact, they don't seem to think about themselves much at all. Some of these people are among us right now, and some of these people have been among us. Some of them were named on the list we chimed today. None of us knows all those people, but I'd be willing to bet you knew someone or even know someone who is extra, extra special. The popular New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote a piece about this a while back, and I've shared it before, and I'm going to share it again because I think it is apropos for us on this day, and especially on this week. Brooks wrote this: "When I meet a person like this, a saint, it brightens my whole day. But I confess I often have a sadder thought. It occurs to me that I have achieved a decent level of career success, but I have not achieved that. I have not achieved that generosity of spirit or that depth of character. But then a few years ago," Brooks said, "I realized that I wanted to be a bit more like those people. And I realized that if I wanted to do that, I was going to have to work harder. I was going to have the sort of moral adventures that produce that kind of goodness. I was going to have to be better at balancing my life. And it occurred to me as I was wrestling with this that there were two sets of virtues that we value: the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the skills you bring to the marketplace, The eulogy virtues are the ones that are talked about at your funeral. Whether you were kind, brave, honest, or faithful. Whether you were capable of deep love. We all know the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume ones, ultimately. But our culture and our educational system spend more time teaching the skills and the strategies you need for career success than the qualities you need to radiate that sort of inner light. Many of us are clearer on how to build an external career than how to build inner character. But if you live for external achievement, years pass and the deepest parts of you go unexplored and unstructured. You lack a moral vocabulary. It becomes easy to slip into a self-satisfied moral mediocrity. You grade yourself on a forgiving curve. You figure, as long as you're not obviously hurting anybody and people seem to like you, you must be okay. But you live with an unconscious boredom, separated from the deepest meaning of life and the highest moral joys. Gradually, a humiliating gap opens between your actual self and your desired self, between you and those incandescent or saintly souls you sometimes meet. Brooks goes on to talk about the ways he thinks people become these incandescent souls. Through years of leaning into humility, acknowledging our own weaknesses, developing deep connections with others, finding and embracing our calling, pushing through our fears, and ultimately learning to embrace love in all things. Jesus talked about these things too, you know. It's the deeper wisdom he called us to when he called us all to become his saints. Are you listening? Are you listening? To those who are still listening, it's the saintly life of love he's calling us to and to pursue still. Most of us have sensed these eulogy values echoing out of the lives of others. But the greater question and the more pertinent question for today is this: how much do you think others currently sense those values echoing out of you? Something significant for each of us and all of us to consider, even now, as we continue to worship.